Before there were kingdoms, before there were even towns, there were simply people. And somewhere around 10,000 BCE, in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, a delightful little arc of land stretching from Mesopotamia down into Egypt, with Canaan nestled right in the middle. These folks started making some truly revolutionary choices. This wasn't some sudden revelation, mind you, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift, like the gentle nudge of a tide turning. For millennia before this, our ancestors were wanderers, following the animals, gathering what nature provided. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, by the movement of herds, by the ripeness of wild grains. But then, something clicked. Perhaps they noticed that if they dropped a seed, a plant would grow. Or maybe they simply got tired of backing up every few weeks. Whatever the catalyst, these early inhabitants of Canaan, much like their neighbors, began to experiment with a new way of life. This was the dawn of settled communities, not yet villages in the sense we understand them, but certainly more than just temporary shelters. They started building more substantial structures, perhaps circular huts made of mud brick, clustered together for safety and companionship. The land itself played a starring role in this unfolding drama. Canaan, with its varied topography, fertile coastal plains, rolling hills, and the deep rift valley of the Jordan, offered diverse environments, each with its own advantages. The Mediterranean climate, generally mild with distinct wet and dry seasons, supported a surprising array of flora and fauna. This natural abundance meant that even before full-scale agriculture, the land could sustain more concentrated groups of people. It was here, amidst these nascent settlements, that the earliest glimmers of what we'd recognize as community began to shine. You can almost hear the murmurs of shared stories around a fire, the communal effort of building a new dwelling, the quiet satisfaction of a successful hunt. One of the most remarkable things about this period, often called the Epipaleolithic or Mesolithic era in the broader Near East, is how subtle yet profound these changes were. We're talking about shifts that played out over hundreds, even thousands of years. Not a quick revolution. It's like watching a glacier move. You don't perceive its motion moment by moment, but over time, it carves out entire valleys. These early Canaanites, though they couldn't have known it, were laying the very groundwork for future civilizations. They were domesticating animals, not just hunting them, leading to a more reliable food source. Goats and sheep, those fluffy, sometimes stubborn creatures, were likely among the first to join the human family. Historians still argue whether this shift to settled life was driven purely by necessity, perhaps due to environmental changes making foraging less reliable, or if it was a slow accumulation of knowledge and a growing confidence in manipulating the natural world. Was it a stroke of genius by one particularly observant individual, or the collective wisdom of generations? We'll likely never know the precise answer, which is in its own way part of the mystery and allure of these distant times. What we do know is that these early encampments were humble, often lacking the impressive architecture of later eras, but they were the vital first step on a very long journey. Imagine stumbling upon one of these ancient sites today. You wouldn't see grand palaces or towering walls, just faint traces in the soil, perhaps the outline of a circular dwelling, a few scattered tools, a hearth where countless meals were cooked and conversation shared. But each one of those faint traces tells a story, a whisper from the deep past about resilience, innovation, and the innate human desire to create a sense of belonging. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. These were the first tentative steps towards making Canaan a home, a process that would profoundly shape its future. It's a reminder that even the grandest empires begin with the simplest foundations, with people daring to dream of a life beyond constant motion. From those humble beginnings, where people first tethered themselves to the land, something truly monumental happened, something so transformative it earned its own grand title, the Neolithic Revolution. Now, if you're picturing a sudden dramatic uprising with pitchforks and torches, you're missing the point entirely. This revolution was far more subtle, a quiet but profound shift that took thousands of years, like watching paint dry, if the paint then completely changed the course of human civilization. Imagine for a moment the sheer brilliance, or perhaps just the accidental genius, of realizing that instead of just finding your next meal, you could grow it. That, my friends, is the essence of it. Around 8500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, the peoples living in Canaan and the wider Fertile Crescent began to transition from being primarily hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. This wasn't a universal light bulb moment for everyone simultaneously, but rather a gradual adoption of new techniques. They started cultivating wild grains, wheat and barley, those unassuming heroes of early agriculture, and domesticating more animals beyond just the initial sheep and goats. Pigs and cattle joined the agrarian family, offering not just meat, but also milk, hides, and eventually muscle power for plowing. It's a bit like upgrading from a manual typewriter to a word processor. Suddenly, your productivity skyrockets. This shift meant a more reliable, if not always easy, food supply. No longer were communities solely at the mercy of the wild hunt or the foraging season. With stored grains, they could weather leaner times, which, in turn, allowed for something truly unprecedented: population growth. More food meant more people, and more people meant larger, more complex settlements. We see the emergence of actual villages now, not just temporary camps. Houses became more substantial, often rectangular, built with mud brick, and sometimes even featuring multiple rooms. Think of it as the first real estate boom, only with a lot more dirt and a distinct lack of indoor plumbing. One of the most iconic examples of a major Neolithic settlement, though not strictly in Canaan itself, but a stone's throw away and deeply interconnected with the regional development, is Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, or closer to home, Jericho. Now, Jericho is fascinating because it shows an incredibly early and persistent human presence. Imagine a walled city, even a rudimentary one, existing 9,000 years ago. It had a massive stone tower and defensive walls, suggesting a level of communal organization and potential conflict that truly blows the mind. Who were they defending against? Other early agriculturalists, perhaps, or lingering hunter-gatherer groups who weren't too keen on sharing the best farmland. The development of agriculture didn't just change how people ate, it changed everything. Social structures began to evolve. With surplus food, not everyone had to farm. Some could specialize, perhaps becoming toolmakers or potters, or even early spiritual leaders. This specialization led to social stratification, meaning some people accumulated more wealth or influence than others. It's a bittersweet truth that with prosperity often comes hierarchy. We also see the invention of pottery during this period, which, while it might seem mundane to us, was a game changer for food storage and cooking. No more soggy animal skins for keeping your grain. Historians still argue whether the development of agriculture was a blessing or a curse for human health in the short term. While it provided more calories, it also often led to less diverse diets, and larger, denser populations meant diseases could spread more easily. So, while it laid the foundation for civilization, it wasn't without its immediate drawbacks. It's a bit like inventing social media, great for connection, but perhaps not so great for mental health. The impact of the Neolithic Revolution on Canaan was profound. The region's fertile plains and accessible water sources made it an ideal cradle for early farming communities. These communities, slowly but surely, began to transform the landscape. Forests were cleared for fields. Irrigation systems, simple at first, began to be developed to maximize crop yields. The rhythm of life shifted from the unpredictable chase to the cyclical nature of planting and harvesting. It instilled a new kind of discipline, a longer-term vision for survival. It was here, in these very fields, that the seeds of future kingdoms were literally sown, nurtured by the relentless sun and the careful hands of generations of farmers who, despite their monumental achievements, likely just thought they were trying to put dinner on the table. So we've moved past the initial settling down and the revolutionary act of growing your own food. Now, imagine a time when humanity started getting a little bit fancier with its tools and possessions. We are talking about the Chalcolithic period, or as some people like to call it, the Copper Age. The name itself gives you the big spoiler. This was the era when copper, a shiny reddish metal, first made its grand entrance onto the historical stage, changing how people lived, worked, and even buried their dead. This period, roughly spanning from 4500 to 3300 BCE, represents a fascinating bridge between the Stone Age and the full-blown Bronze Age that would follow. It's like the awkward teenage years of civilization, full of experimentation and rapid growth. Before this, tools were primarily made of stone, flint being a particular favorite for its sharp edges. And while stone tools were remarkably effective, copper offered something new. It could be melted, poured into molds, and shaped into various forms, then hardened. This wasn't some sudden technological leap, more like a slow, painstaking discovery. Imagine someone accidentally dropping a piece of copper ore into a fire and noticing a gleaming, malleable blob emerge. That initial oops moment likely kicked off 1,000 years of tinkering. The earliest copper artifacts weren't weapons of mass destruction, but rather small tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. It was a luxury item before it was a utilitarian one, like owning the first clunky smartphone before it became indispensable. In Canaan, the Chalcolithic period saw the flourishing of distinct cultures, each with its own unique flair. The Gasulian culture, named after the site of Tel Gasul in the Jordan Valley, is a prime example. These folks were quite sophisticated for their time. We find evidence of larger, more complex villages, some with impressive public buildings, perhaps even cultic centers. Their houses were often rectangular, built of mud brick and quite spacious. They weren't just living, they were living. They developed a distinctive pottery style, often decorated with geometric patterns, and sometimes even human or animal figures. It's like they were finally getting around to decorating their homes after centuries of just bare walls. But perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of the Gasulian culture and Chalcolithic Canaan in general is their burial practices. They didn't just put bodies in the ground. Oh no. They had elaborate ossuaries, bone boxes, often shaped like animals or even miniature houses, where they rebreathed the bones of their ancestors after the flesh had decomposed. Imagine the ritual, the care, the reverence for the dead. It suggests a complex belief system, a deep connection to lineage, and perhaps even a belief in an afterlife. It's a stark reminder that these weren't just primitive people. They were thinking, feeling humans grappling with the big questions of existence. Historians still argue whether the elaborate ossuaries suggest a nomadic past where they would carry the bones with them, or simply a refined spiritual practice unique to the region. The discovery and working of copper weren't confined to Canaan, of course. Mining operations, particularly in areas like the Araba Valley, south of the Dead Sea, became increasingly important. This wasn't just digging a hole, it involved specialized knowledge, techniques for extracting the ore, and understanding how to smelt it at high temperatures. This specialization led to further divisions of labor within society. You had miners, smelters, smiths, and traders. Trade networks expanded as people sought out sources of copper and distributed finished goods. This wasn't just local bartering. We're talking about regional exchange, connecting communities across landscapes, laying the groundwork for more extensive commerce later on. It's almost like the first supply chain management course was taught in a dusty Chalcolithic village. The Chalcolithic period in Canaan also saw advancements in agricultural technology. The use of the plow, pulled by oxen, became more widespread, allowing for larger areas to be cultivated with less human effort. This further increased food production, supporting even denser populations. Water management techniques, though still rudimentary, also improved, demonstrating an increasing understanding of their environment. So while the copper gets all the headlines, the farmers were still the unsung heroes, churning out the calories that fueled this growing complexity. This was a time of dynamic change, where innovations, both practical and artistic, laid the foundation for the sophisticated urban societies that would soon emerge in the land of Canaan. It was a time when people started truly understanding the power of creation, both from the earth and from their own ingenuity. Now, if the Chalcolithic period was civilization's awkward adolescence, then the early Bronze Age, roughly from 3300 to 2000 BCE, was its growth spurt, its rebellious phase, and its grand entrance onto the world stage, all rolled into one. This wasn't just about bigger villages. This was about the birth of cities. Real cities, with walls, public buildings, and thousands of inhabitants. Imagine leaving your small, familiar village and walking into a bustling, crowded settlement with a marketplace, specialized craftsmen, and a proper governing structure. It must have felt like stepping into a whole new world, a bit like visiting a futuristic metropolis after growing up in a quiet rural town. The key to this urban explosion wasn't just copper, which was still important, but the widespread adoption of bronze. This wasn't a sudden invention, but a gradual discovery that if you alloyed copper with a bit of tin, you got a much harder, more durable metal. Bronze was superior for tools and, crucially, for weapons. This technological leap had profound implications for warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship. Suddenly, you could have better plows, sturdier axes for clearing land, and sharper, more effective spears and swords. It's like upgrading your entire toolkit, from hand tools to power tools, overnight. In Canaan, the early Bronze Age saw a dramatic increase in the number and size of settlements. Sites like Tel Megiddo, Tel Hazor, and Tel Lachish, names that will echo through centuries of history, began to emerge as significant urban centers. These weren't just accidental clusters of homes. They were planned, fortified cities, often built on strategic tells, mounds formed over centuries of human occupation that offered natural defensive advantages. The construction of massive city walls, some incredibly thick and tall, speaks volumes about the perceived need for defense, suggesting an increase in intercity conflict or external threats. It's a sobering thought that the very act of building a city often meant building its defenses simultaneously. The rise of these urban centers brought about complex social and political changes. We see the emergence of city-states, each with its own ruler, its own distinct identity, and its own territory. These were independent entities, sometimes allied, often in competition. Think of them as tiny sovereign nations, each vying for resources, trade routes, and influence. This decentralized political landscape is a hallmark of early Bronze Age Canaan. There wasn't one overarching kingdom, but a mosaic of smaller powers, a bit like a medieval European map, but with more sand and fewer knights in shining armor. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a sophisticated economy based on agriculture, crafts, and trade. Pottery became standardized and mass-produced, indicating specialized workshops. There's also evidence of long-distance trade, with goods like olive oil, wine, and possibly grain being exchanged for timber, metals, and luxury items from Egypt and Mesopotamia. This wasn't just bartering. This was an organized system of commerce with established routes and likely early forms of economic agreements. The people of Canaan were clearly not isolated. They were plugged into a wider Near Eastern economic network. A fascinating, yet somewhat mysterious, aspect of the early Bronze Age in Canaan is its eventual collapse, often referred to as the EB3 collapse, around 2300-2000 BCE. Many major urban centers were abandoned or destroyed, and there's evidence of a return to more rural, less centralized living. Historians still argue whether this collapse was due to climate change, perhaps prolonged droughts, internal societal pressures, nomadic incursions, or a combination of factors. It's a historical whodunit that keeps scholars busy, like a really old cold case. Whatever the cause, it represents a significant discontinuity in the urban development of Canaan, a brief but impactful regression before the next great wave of city building. It reminds us that progress isn't always linear, and sometimes even thriving civilizations can stumble and fall, only to rise again, often in new and unexpected forms. Imagine living in a place that, despite its own internal dynamics, somehow keeps attracting the attention of powerful empires. That was the story of Canaan during the urbanization flourishes phase of the early Bronze Age. This wasn't just about building a few more houses. It was about entire societies reorganizing themselves around monumental architecture, complex administration, and a burgeoning sense of civic identity. We're talking about cities like Jericho and Megiddo, already mentioned, but also Beth Shan, Ai, and numerous others, evolving from large villages into true urban centers, buzzing with life and activity. These cities weren't simply larger versions of earlier settlements. They were qualitatively different. The presence of massive defensive walls, sometimes several layers thick, wasn't just for show. These fortifications required immense communal labor, centralized planning, and a strong leadership to organize their construction. It tells us that the inhabitants perceived significant threats, either from rival city-states within Canaan, or from nomadic groups, or perhaps even from burgeoning powers beyond their immediate borders. Imagine thousands of people, day in and day out, hauling massive stones and mud bricks under the direction of an unseen authority. It speaks volumes about the early development of social hierarchy and coordinated effort. Within these walls, life was becoming increasingly specialized. While agriculture still formed the backbone of the economy, feeding the populace, we see clear archaeological evidence of dedicated craft quarters. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, and stone carvers didn't just dabble. They produced goods on a larger scale, often for trade. This specialization led to increased economic complexity, requiring systems for exchange, storage, and distribution. Think of it as the early stages of an industrial zone, just without the smokestacks and air protection. The internal layout of these cities often reveals a degree of planning. There might be a central public area, perhaps a temple or administrative building, and residential quarters, sometimes differentiated by social status. The houses themselves, typically rectangular with multiple rooms, suggest a shift towards more private family units, yet still within a close-knit urban fabric. They weren't exactly sprawling mansions, but they were certainly an upgrade from the circular huts of earlier periods. You can almost hear the clatter of daily life, the shouts of vendors in a rudimentary market, the sounds of children playing in narrow alleys. A crucial aspect of this flourishing urbanization was the development of trade networks. Canaan, strategically located between the great civilizations of Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the northeast, became a vital crossroads. Goods flowed through the region: timber from Lebanon, copper from the Arabah, obsidian from Anatolia, and luxury items from Egypt and Mesopotamia, often exchanged for Canaanite products like olive oil and wine. This wasn't just about moving goods. It was about the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. The cities of Canaan were becoming melting pots, albeit on a smaller, ancient scale, absorbing influences from various directions and adapting them. However, despite this impressive urban growth, the political landscape of early Bronze Age Canaan remained largely fragmented. It was a collection of independent city-states, each with its own ruler, often a local king or chieftain. There wasn't a unified Canaanite empire. Instead, alliances shifted, conflicts erupted, and periods of dominance by one city over another were common. Historians still argue whether these city-states developed sophisticated legal codes similar to those found in Mesopotamia, or if governance remained more informal and based on customary law. This decentralized nature would prove both a strength and a weakness in later periods, making it resilient in some ways, but vulnerable to external powers in others. The sheer scale of these urban centers, with populations that could number in the thousands, required a robust administrative system. Even if we don't have extensive written records from this early period to fully understand it, we can infer the presence of scribes, overseers, and a priestly class responsible for religious rituals, all contributing to the smooth functioning of these complex societies. The early Bronze Age in Canaan was, in many ways, the pinnacle of indigenous development before the region became increasingly intertwined with, and often dominated by, the grander empires rising around it. It was a period when Canaan truly came into its own, establishing the foundations of its unique cultural identity. Now, if you're a small, prosperous region sitting right on the main highway between two colossal empires, you're bound to attract attention, and often not the friendly kind. Such was the fate of Canaan, as the mighty civilization of Egypt began to cast its long shadow across the land. This wasn't a sudden invasion with trumpets and chariots right off the bat, but rather a gradual process, like a slow tide coming in, starting with trade and cultural exchange, and eventually leading to more direct influence and even control. The earliest whispers of Egyptian presence in Canaan go back even further than the early Bronze Age, with archaeological finds showing Egyptian artifacts in the region from as early as the pre-dynastic period. But it was during the early dynastic period in Egypt, around 3100-2686 BCE, and especially the Old Kingdom, 2686-181 BCE, that this relationship deepened significantly. Egypt was consolidating its power, building its iconic pyramids, and importantly, looking beyond its borders for resources it lacked. And what did Canaan have in abundance? Timber, particularly cedar from Lebanon, and perhaps copper and other raw materials. So the relationship began primarily as one of trade. Egyptian expeditions, often state-sponsored, would journey north into Canaan, bringing back valuable commodities. We have archaeological evidence of Egyptian pottery, tools, and luxury goods found in Canaanite cities, indicating a robust exchange. This wasn't just about goods. It was also about the flow of ideas, artistic styles, and technological know-how. Canaanite craftsmen might have observed Egyptian techniques, and Egyptian scribes might have encountered Canaanite customs. It was a cultural osmosis, slowly but surely shaping the region. It's like when a new trend hits the big cities and slowly trickles down to smaller towns. However, influence wasn't always benign. During certain periods, particularly the First Dynasty of Egypt, there's evidence of more direct military incursions into southern Canaan. This wasn't necessarily about permanent conquest at this stage, but rather punitive raids to secure trade routes, suppress unruly elements, or simply to assert Egyptian dominance and extract resources. Imagine a powerful neighbor occasionally popping over to remind you who's boss, maybe taking a few of your best fruit trees on the way out. These early military forays, though perhaps localized, served as a precursor to much more extensive Egyptian involvement in later centuries. Archaeological sites like Tel Irani in southern Canaan have yielded significant quantities of Egyptian pottery and other artifacts from this early period, suggesting a strong Egyptian presence, possibly even settlements or trading posts. It implies that the relationship was not just fleeting visits, but involved some level of sustained interaction. One mainstream historical fact is the presence of Egyptian scarabs and administrative seals found throughout Canaan, indicating official contact and economic transactions. As the Old Kingdom of Egypt began to wane, entering what historians call the First Intermediate Period, around 21 to 81 2055 BCE, Egyptian influence in Canaan temporarily receded. This was a period of decentralization and internal strife within Egypt itself, meaning they had less capacity and fewer resources to project power outwards. This created a vacuum in Canaan, allowing the local city-states to reassert their independence, sometimes flourishing, sometimes falling into conflict with each other. It's like the playground bully getting distracted, giving the smaller kids a chance to figure things out amongst themselves. Historians still argue whether this Egyptian retreat contributed directly to the early Bronze Age collapse in Canaan, or if the two were merely coincidental, each suffering from broader regional instability. But this temporary withdrawal wouldn't last. The seed of Egyptian interest in Canaan had been firmly planted. The geographical proximity, the vital trade routes, and the strategic importance of Canaan as a buffer zone meant that Egypt would inevitably return, and with even greater force, in the centuries to come. The initial interactions, whether through trade or sporadic military action, established a pattern that would define much of Canaan's history. A land caught between the ambitions of powerful empires, forever adapting, sometimes resisting, but always influenced by its formidable neighbors. After the relative quietude and decentralization that followed the early Bronze Age collapse and the temporary withdrawal of Egyptian influence, Canaan began to gather itself, entering a period that many scholars consider its most prosperous and culturally vibrant, the Middle Bronze Age. This era, roughly from 2000 to 1550 BCE, saw the cities of Canaan not just recover, but flourish like never before, becoming pivotal hubs in a vast, interconnected Near Eastern world. Imagine a small country suddenly finding itself at the center of global trade, with caravans and ships constantly passing through, bringing wealth and new ideas. That was Canaan. This wasn't just a recovery. It was a grand reawakening. New urban centers rose, or old ones were rebuilt on an even grander scale. Tel Hazor in the north, for instance, became an enormous city, possibly one of the largest in the entire Levant, covering vast areas and boasting impressive fortifications and monumental architecture. Cities like Megiddo, Shechem, and Lachish also regained prominence, acting as independent city-states, each with its own ruler, its own administration, and often its own distinct artistic and architectural style. This period saw the return of strong, centralized authorities within each city, necessary to manage the growing populations, complex economies, and extensive trade networks. What fueled this prosperity? Several factors. Firstly, advancements in agriculture continued, leading to even greater food surpluses. Better irrigation techniques, more efficient plows, and improved understanding of crop rotation meant the land could support more people and generate more wealth. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, was Canaan's renewed role as a trade nexus. Egypt, having recovered from its first intermediate period, and now in its powerful Middle Kingdom, 2045-1650 BCE, once again looked north for resources. Mesopotamia, thriving under various dynasties, also maintained strong commercial ties. Canaan sat squarely in the middle, a crucial land bridge for goods moving between these two giants, as well as a maritime link across the Mediterranean. Goods flowing through Canaan included precious metals, timber, oils, wine, textiles, and even slaves. The city-states of Canaan themselves became adept traders, producing and exporting their own goods, particularly olive oil and wine, which were highly prized. The sheer volume of trade meant that wealth accumulated in the Canaanite cities, allowing for monumental construction, the patronage of artisans, and the development of sophisticated social structures. It's like being the main highway rest stop between two major metropolises. Everyone passes through, and they all need something. Architecturally, the Middle Bronze Age is characterized by massive glacis fortifications, sloped earthen ramparts faced with stone or plaster, making it incredibly difficult for attackers to scale the walls or undermine them. These were serious defenses, reflecting both the wealth available for construction and the ongoing need for protection in a world of competing city-states. We also see sophisticated water systems, including deep wells and reservoirs, indicating advanced engineering capabilities. Culturally, the Middle Bronze Age in Canaan saw a rich blend of local traditions mixed with influences from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Art, pottery, and religious practices show clear evidence of this syncretism. For example, local deities were often depicted with Egyptian iconography, or Canaanite myths might incorporate Mesopotamian motifs. One mainstream historical fact is the widespread use of Hyksos-style pottery, Kamares ware, a distinctive ceramic tradition that spread throughout the region, reflecting both local innovation and interregional connections. The political landscape remained one of independent city-states, but these states were often connected by treaties, marriage alliances, or sometimes by a subtle overarching influence from a greater power. Egypt, particularly during the powerful 12th dynasty, exerted its presence through trade, diplomacy, and occasional military expeditions, but generally allowed Canaanite rulers a high degree of autonomy, as long as trade flowed smoothly and tribute was sometimes paid. Historians still argue whether the concept of a king in Middle Bronze Age Canaan truly mirrored the centralized divine kingship of Egypt, or if it was a more localized, chieftain-like authority. It was a complex dance of power, where local rulers navigated the currents of regional geopolitics, often with surprising success, making this a truly golden age for ancient Canaan. Just when Canaan was basking in its Middle Bronze Age prosperity, minding its own business, and enjoying its role as a bustling trade hub, a truly enigmatic group entered the scene and for a couple of centuries turned parts of the Near East, including Egypt, completely upside down. These were the Hyksos, a name that sounds a bit like a forgotten breakfast cereal, but whose impact was anything but bland. Roughly from 1650 to 1550 BCE, these foreign rulers, as the Egyptians called them, dominated Egypt and, by extension, exerted significant influence over Canaan. Now, who exactly were the Hyksos? That's where the mystery really deepens, and historians still debate their precise origins. The most widely accepted theory is that they were a diverse group of Semitic-speaking peoples, possibly originating from the Levant itself, or from areas to the east, who gradually migrated into the Nile Delta region of Egypt. They weren't a single, unified ethnic group, but rather a confederation of various peoples who shared a common cultural horizon. Imagine a powerful nomadic conglomerate with superior military technology slowly but surely gaining control. Their secret weapon, probably the horse-drawn chariot and improved composite bows. While chariots weren't entirely unknown in the Near East, the Hyksos effectively weaponized them, using them as fast, mobile platforms for archers. Against the slower, infantry-focused armies of the Egyptians at the time, this was a game-changer, like bringing a fighter jet to a medieval jousting tournament. Their military superiority allowed them to first infiltrate and then eventually seize control of Lower Egypt, establishing their capital at Avaris in the Nile Delta. With their control over Lower Egypt, the Hyksos naturally extended their dominion over Canaan. The city-states of Canaan, already accustomed to Egyptian influence, now found themselves under the sway of these new overlords. However, unlike earlier Egyptian pharaohs who often ruled Canaan indirectly, the Hyksos' connection was much more direct and integrated. Avaris, their capital, was geographically very close to Canaan, fostering strong cultural and economic ties. It's almost like Canaan became the Hyksos' backyard, accessible and strategically important. Archaeological evidence in Canaan during the Hyksos period shows a marked continuity with Middle Bronze Age culture, but with strong Hyksos influences. We find similar pottery styles, burial customs, and fortification techniques, like the widespread use of the glasses. Some scholars even suggest that the Hyksos brought with them certain Canaanite religious practices and deities, which might have even influenced Egyptian religion to some degree. It was a fascinating period of cultural exchange, even amidst political domination. One mainstream historical fact from this period is the widespread adoption of the scarab seal as a form of personal identification and amulet throughout Canaan, often bearing Hyksos royal names or titles, signifying their broad influence. The Hyksos rule wasn't universally welcomed by the Egyptians. Upper Egypt remained under the control of native Egyptian pharaohs who viewed the Hyksos as illegitimate foreign occupiers. This set the stage for a prolonged period of conflict, culminating in the War of Liberation, led by the Egyptian pharaohs of the 17th and 18th dynasties. Pharaohs like Kamose and Ahmose launched campaigns to expel the Hyksos, slowly pushing them back towards Canaan. The expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt around 1550 BCE had a profound and immediate impact on Canaan. As the Egyptians pursued the retreating Hyksos, they effectively re-established their control over Canaan, but this time with a far more aggressive and imperialistic approach. The Hyksos period, while brief, fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of the Near East. It taught the Egyptians a harsh lesson about foreign threats and equipped them with new military technologies, like the chariot, which they then turned on their neighbors. For Canaan, it meant transitioning from the indirect influence of the Middle Kingdom to the direct, often heavy-handed, control of the burgeoning new Kingdom of Egypt. The honeymoon period of prosperity was about to face some serious challenges. With the Hyksos unceremoniously kicked out of Egypt, the stage was set for a new act in Canaan's long drama, the Late Bronze Age, roughly from 1550 to 1200 BCE. This era saw Canaan caught between two increasingly aggressive superpowers, like a small child trying to play quietly between two wrestling giants. The result? A fragmented land, a patchwork of competing city-states, all under the heavy, albeit sometimes distant, thumb of the mighty new kingdom of Egypt. Egypt, having learned its lesson about foreign invaders from the Hyksos, emerged from its war of liberation as a formidable imperialistic power. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, though Thutmose came first, so perhaps Napoleon was the Thutmose of Europe, launched extensive military campaigns into Canaan and beyond. Their goal was clear: establish a firm grip on the Levant, secure trade routes, and create a buffer zone against any future threats. This meant that the independent city-states of the Middle Bronze Age, which had enjoyed a degree of autonomy, now found themselves firmly within the Egyptian sphere of influence, often reduced to vassal states. Imagine being a local ruler in a Canaanite city, suddenly facing the might of the Egyptian army. You'd have little choice but to swear fealty, pay tribute, often in grain, oil, copper, or even skilled artisans, and host Egyptian garrisons. The Egyptians didn't necessarily impose direct rule over every single town. Instead, they preferred a system of vassalage, where local kings were allowed to maintain their thrones, provided they remained loyal, paid their dues, and didn't cause too much trouble. It was a bit like a feudal system, with the pharaoh as the ultimate overlord. This period in Canaan is characterized by a remarkable degree of fragmentation. There wasn't a unified Canaanite kingdom. Instead, hundreds of small city-states, each governing a limited territory, squabbled amongst themselves, often appealing to their Egyptian overlord to arbitrate disputes or to gain an advantage over a rival. This internal strife, coupled with Egyptian demands, meant constant political maneuvering and shifting alliances. It's like watching a complicated reality TV show, but with actual kingdoms at stake. One of the most fascinating insights into this complex political landscape comes from the Amarna letters, which we'll dive into more deeply next. These diplomatic correspondences between Egyptian pharaohs, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and their Canaanite vassals, as well as other great powers, vividly illustrate the constant jockeying for position, the pleas for military assistance against local rivals or invading groups like the enigmatic Habiru, and the endless assurances of loyalty, often with a subtle undertone of desperation. Economically, Canaan continued to be a crucial trade route, but now much of the wealth generated flowed towards Egypt in the form of tribute. However, local economies still thrived to some extent, adapting to the demands of their Egyptian masters. We see evidence of Egyptian artistic styles and cultural practices permeating Canaanite society, from pottery and scarabs to religious motifs. It wasn't just imposition. There was a degree of cultural assimilation and adaptation. One mainstream historical fact is the discovery of numerous Egyptian-style temples and cultic objects at sites like Beth Shean, indicating the official presence and influence of Egyptian religion alongside local Canaanite worship. Despite the prosperity and the veneer of stability offered by Egyptian rule, the Late Bronze Age in Canaan was inherently precarious. The constant infighting among city-states, the burden of tribute, and the emerging threats from new groups like the Hittites to the north and the Sea Peoples later on, all contributed to a volatile environment. It was a period of both splendor and simmering instability, where the magnificent achievements of Canaanite culture blossomed under the watchful eye of a superpower, always knowing that their fate ultimately rested in the hands of the pharaoh across the desert. If you ever wanted a peek into the ancient world's version of international diplomacy, complete with backstabbing, earnest pleas, and passive-aggressive complaints, then the Amarna letters are your golden ticket. Discovered serendipitously in 1887 at Amarna, Egypt, the short-lived capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten. This archive of over 380 clay tablets, written mostly in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the day, offers an unparalleled glimpse into the political realities of the late Bronze Age, mid-14th century BCE, in Canaan and the wider Near East. It's like finding a secret trove of ancient emails, but far more exciting. Imagine the bustling royal court in Egypt, hundreds of scribes meticulously carving messages into wet clay, sealing them, and sending them off via messengers on dangerous routes. These letters weren't just formal declarations. They were often desperate cries for help, detailed reports, and sometimes, frankly, thinly veiled excuses. They reveal a world where diplomacy was a complex dance of power, obligation, and self-preservation. One mainstream historical fact is that the Amarna letters are the largest collection of diplomatic correspondence from the ancient Near East ever discovered, providing an incredibly rich primary source. The bulk of the letters are from Canaanite vassal rulers to the Egyptian pharaohs, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. These local kings, often addressing the pharaoh as "my lord," "my son," constantly reiterated their loyalty and dependence, sometimes with a touch of theatrical humility. But beneath the flowery language lay a fierce competition among themselves. King Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem, for instance, frequently complained about the machinations of rival Canaanite rulers, accusing them of disloyalty and even attacking his territory, all while earnestly pleading for Egyptian troops to restore order. It's a bit like watching a bunch of siblings squabble, but with real armies involved. The letters reveal a Canaanite landscape deeply fragmented, as we discussed. Each city-state was largely independent in its internal affairs, but utterly dependent on Egypt for security and legitimacy. The pharaoh was the ultimate arbiter, and the Canaanite rulers constantly sought his favor and military support. This system, however, wasn't always efficient. The pharaohs, particularly Akhenaten, seemed preoccupied with internal religious reforms, the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, and often slow to respond to the urgent pleas from their vassals. This perceived indifference or delay only exacerbated the instability in Canaan, as local conflicts escalated without swift Egyptian intervention. A recurring theme in the Amarna letters is the threat posed by groups known as the Habiru, sometimes rendered Apiru. Who were they? Historians still argue whether the Habiru were a distinct ethnic group, nomadic raiders, landless mercenaries, or a social class of displaced persons. The Canaanite rulers consistently accused them of attacking their cities and disrupting trade, often begging the pharaoh to send troops to deal with this pervasive threat. Some scholars even suggest a potential, albeit debated, link between the Habiru and the later biblical Hebrews, adding another layer of intrigue to these ancient documents. It's one of those tantalizing historical mysteries that keeps us guessing. The letters also shed light on the economic relationship between Egypt and Canaan. Tributes were expected: gold, silver, horses, chariots, and grain, but also military service from Canaanite troops. The pharaohs, in turn, provided protection, sometimes sending small contingents of troops, and bestowed gifts, reinforcing the reciprocal, though heavily imbalanced, nature of the relationship. It was a patronage system where loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty could lead to swift and brutal consequences. Ultimately, the Amarna letters paint a vivid picture of a late Bronze Age Canaan that was politically volatile, economically strained by tribute, and constantly navigating the shifting sands of imperial power and local rivalries. They are a poignant testament to the anxieties and aspirations of ancient rulers, struggling to maintain their hold on power in a dangerous world, all while appealing to an often distant and seemingly distracted superpower. So while Canaan's city-states were busy sending frantic messages to Egypt, begging for help against the pesky Habiru, and squabbling amongst themselves, a new, equally formidable power was rising in the north, gradually asserting its influence over parts of the Near East. We are talking about the Hittites, an Anatolian empire whose name alone sounds like it belongs in a heavy metal band. Their emergence on the scene around 1400 BCE set the stage for a grand geopolitical showdown, a wrestling match between the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian New Kingdom for control over vital territories, with Canaan often caught squarely in the middle. Imagine two massive superpowers, each believing it has a divine right to expand its influence, slowly but surely bumping up against each other's spheres of interest. This wasn't some minor border skirmish. This was the clash of titans, shaping the map of the ancient world. The Hittites, with their capital at Hattusa in modern-day Turkey, were masters of iron working, a technological advantage that would become increasingly significant, and possessed a well-organized military, complete with highly effective chariots. Initially, Egyptian power extended northward through Canaan, reaching as far as southern Syria. But as the Hittites expanded southward, they began to absorb states that were nominally under Egyptian influence, or were seen by Egypt as its buffer zones. This created a tension that escalated over decades. The main prize? The fertile lands and strategic trade routes of Syria and northern Canaan. Control of these regions meant not just wealth, but also security. It's like two rival corporations battling for market share in a highly lucrative territory. The rivalry culminated in some of the most famous battles of the late Bronze Age. While the direct battle for Canaan was largely fought through proxy states and diplomatic maneuvering, the grandest confrontation was undoubtedly the Battle of Kadesh, circa 1274 BCE, in Syria, during the reign of Pharaoh Rameses II and Hittite King Muwatalli II. This epic clash, one of the best documented battles of antiquity, involved thousands of chariots and infantry on both sides. While both empires claimed victory, the reality was likely a costly stalemate, leading to the world's first known peace treaty, signed almost 2 decades later. This treaty, known as the Treaty of Kadesh, effectively divided spheres of influence in the Levant, with northern Syria falling more firmly under Hittite control, and Canaan remaining largely within the Egyptian sphere. For the Canaanite city-states, this rivalry meant constant pressure from both sides. They were forced to declare allegiance, pay tribute, and sometimes even provide troops for either the Egyptian or the Hittite cause. This often put local rulers in an impossible position, trying to balance the demands of a distant pharaoh with the looming threat of the Hittite army from the north. One open scholarly debate phrase is whether the constant pressure from the Egyptian-Hittite rivalry ultimately weakened the Canaanite city-states, making them more vulnerable to subsequent internal collapse or external invasions. It's like being stuck between a rock and a very hard place, and both places are throwing rocks. Despite the political turmoil, the cultural exchange between these great powers and Canaan continued. Egyptian goods and artistic styles found their way into Hittite territory through Canaan, and vice versa. Canaanite scribes, for example, would have been familiar with both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform used by the Hittites, acting as cultural intermediaries. Ultimately, while the Hittite-Egyptian rivalry defined much of the late Bronze Age, it also, paradoxically, maintained a certain balance of power that prevented one empire from completely dominating the entire Near East. However, this delicate balance was about to be shattered by entirely new and unforeseen forces. Forces that would bring about a cataclysmic end to this age of empires and redefine the very nature of civilization in Canaan and beyond. The stage was set, the powerful players were in place, but a rogue element was about to crash the party. Just when the ancient world thought it had figured out the whole empire thing, with Egypt and the Hittites playing their elaborate geopolitical game, something truly disruptive happened. Imagine a sudden, inexplicable wave of migrations appearing seemingly out of nowhere, bringing widespread destruction and fundamentally altering the landscape of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. These were the Sea Peoples, and their arrival around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC marked a turning point, a cataclysm that contributed significantly to what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. It's like a sudden, unexpected meteor shower. Only the meteors were armed and very, very angry. Who exactly were these Sea Peoples? That's another one of history's great enduring mysteries, and historians still argue whether they were a unified ethnic group, a coalition of various disparate peoples, or simply opportunistic raiders drawn by the weakening empires. Egyptian records, particularly those from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III, are our primary source of information, depicting them as fearsome invaders arriving by sea and land, attacking Egypt and its vassals. The Egyptians called them by names like the Peleset, thought to be the Philistines, Sherdin, Luka, Ekwesh, and Shekelesh. They were a diverse bunch, but they shared a common modus operandi: destruction and displacement. The arrival of the Sea Peoples wasn't a single coordinated invasion, but rather a series of movements and incursions over several decades. They seem to have swept through Anatolia, perhaps contributing to the downfall of the Hittite Empire, and then moved south along the coast of the Levant, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Major cities in Ugarit, Syria, Al-Alaq, and other centers were sacked and burned. The evidence is stark. Layers of ash and destruction had countless archaeological sites across the region, tell a grim story of sudden, violent ends for once thriving urban centers. For Canaan, already reeling from internal squabbles and the pressures of Egyptian overlordship, the Sea Peoples were a devastating blow. Many Canaanite cities were destroyed, their populations scattered or absorbed. While Egypt managed to repel the main waves of Sea People invaders from its own borders, famously depicted in reliefs at Medinet Habu from Ramesses III's mortuary temple. This victory came at a great cost. The constant warfare and the disruption of trade routes severely weakened Egypt's control over Canaan. One mainstream historical fact is that the Peleset, a group among the Sea Peoples, are widely believed to have settled along the southern coast of Canaan after being repelled by Egypt, eventually becoming the Philistines of biblical fame. Their distinct pottery, architecture, and cultural practices, found at sites like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron, clearly differentiate them from the indigenous Canaanite population, providing tangible evidence of their arrival and settlement. Imagine a group of pirates deciding to settle down and start a farming community. Only they kept their swords and strange customs. The impact of the Sea Peoples was far-reaching. They didn't just destroy cities, they destabilized the entire late Bronze Age system. The elaborate long-distance trade networks, which had been the lifeblood of the great empires and Canaanite prosperity, collapsed. The flow of tin, vital for bronze production, was disrupted, leading to a decline in bronze metallurgy and perhaps forcing the early adoption of iron. Though that's a story for another time. Without the centralized authority of empires and the stability of trade, societies fragmented further. Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse or merely a symptom of wider systemic issues, such as climate change, internal revolts, or economic vulnerabilities. It's likely a complex interplay of factors, a perfect storm that brought down an entire era. Regardless, their arrival was a significant catalyst, shattering the established order and ushering in a dark age for much of the Near East. For Canaan, it meant an end to the era of Egyptian dominance and the beginning of a period of profound reordering where new peoples and new political entities would emerge from the ashes of the old. The mighty empires had fallen, and Canaan was left to pick up the pieces, facing an uncertain future in a dramatically changed world. If the late Bronze Age was the grand, albeit fragile party, then the period immediately following the Sea Peoples' incursions was the monumental hangover. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a truly bewildering and catastrophic period spanning roughly from 1200 to 1150 BCE. That saw the widespread and simultaneous demise of nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Imagine a complex, interconnected machine suddenly grinding to a halt, every gear seizing up at once. It's one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, a true whodunit on a grand, terrifying scale. It wasn't just one empire falling, it was all of them. The magnificent Hittite Empire in Anatolia simply vanished from the historical record. Its cities burned, its centralized government dissolved. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece crumbled, its palaces destroyed, its writing system, Linear B, lost. Ugarit, a thriving Canaanite Syrian port city, sent desperate final letters before being utterly annihilated. Even the mighty New Kingdom of Egypt, though it survived as a political entity, was severely weakened, losing its grip on its external territories and entering a period of decline. For Canaan, this meant the sudden and complete withdrawal of Egyptian authority, leaving a power vacuum and a devastated landscape. So what happened? Historians still argue whether it was primarily the sea peoples, climate change, internal revolts, economic collapse, or a combination of all these factors. It's like trying to figure out if a multi-car pileup was caused by a single distracted driver, black ice, or simply too many cars on the road. Climate change. One leading theory points to prolonged droughts, perhaps exacerbated by deforestation and overfarming, leading to widespread famine. A hungry population is a desperate population prone to migration and internal unrest. If the agricultural base couldn't sustain the large urban populations and the elaborate administrative systems, then the entire structure would inevitably buckle. Internal revolts and social unrest. Perhaps the rigid social hierarchies of the late Bronze Age empires, with their demanding tribute systems and forced labor, became unsustainable. Peasant revolts or slave uprisings could have weakened central authorities from within, making them vulnerable to external threats. The Habiru, mentioned in the Amana letters, might be an example of such internal strife or displaced populations. Systemic economic collapse. The intricate network of long-distance trade, vital for resources like tin for bronze, timber, and luxury goods, may have broken down. If one link in the chain snapped, the ripple effect could have brought down the whole system. Without bronze, armies couldn't be properly equipped. Without food, populations starved. This is an open, scholarly debate phrase. Was the collapse a domino effect of interconnected systems failing simultaneously? The Sea Peoples. As we discussed, their relentless incursions certainly acted as a major catalyst, destroying coastal cities, disrupting trade, and draining the resources of the great empires. They were the final destructive blow for many already teetering polities. For Canaan, the immediate aftermath was devastating. Cities were sacked and abandoned. The sophisticated urban culture of the Middle and Late Bronze Ages largely disappeared. Populations dispersed, often retreating to smaller, more defensible hill country settlements. The vibrant international trade ceased. It was, quite literally, a dark age, marked by a decline in literacy, complex administration, and large-scale monumental building. The elaborate Bronze Age palace economies were replaced by simpler, more localized, and often subsistence-level economies. However, amidst the widespread destruction, something new was also beginning to stir. While the great empires crumbled, smaller, more resilient, and often newly emerging groups began to forge new identities and new ways of life in the fragmented landscape. This collapse, while devastating, cleared the slate for the emergence of entirely new political and ethnic entities in Canaan during the subsequent Iron Age, including the Philistines, the Arameans, and of course, the Israelites. The old order was gone, but the stage was being set for a radically different future. From the ashes and confusion of the Bronze Age collapse, a new, starkly different world slowly began to emerge in Canaan. This was the dawn of the early Iron Age, roughly spanning from 1200 to 1000 BCE. Imagine the lights going out on a grand, elaborate stage, only to slowly flicker back on, revealing a completely rearranged set with new actors and a much simpler, grittier aesthetic. This was a period of profound societal transformation, marked by a decline in complex urbanism, a shift in technology, and the emergence of distinct new peoples and political entities. The most defining characteristic of this era, as the name suggests, was the widespread adoption of iron. Before this, bronze had been the dominant metal for tools and weapons, but tin, a crucial component of bronze, became scarce after the collapse of the long-distance trade networks. Iron, on the other hand, was far more abundant, especially in regions like Anatolia and parts of the Levant. However, working iron was much more difficult than working bronze. It required higher temperatures for smelting and more sophisticated forging techniques. So, while bronze production largely ceased, smiths had to innovate, developing the skills to extract and shape this harder, more challenging metal. One mainstream historical fact is that the transition to iron technology, while initially leading to cruder tools, eventually democratized metal access, as iron ore was far more accessible than tin. For Canaan, the immediate aftermath of the collapse saw a sharp decline in large urban centers. Many of the grand late Bronze Age cities lay in ruins or were drastically reduced in size. Population shifted, often moving into the hill country, areas that were previously less densely settled. This move might have been driven by a desire for security, by the availability of new, unexploited agricultural land, or simply by the general fragmentation of society. These new settlements were typically smaller, often unwalled, and focused on subsistence agriculture. It's like everyone decided to abandon the crowded city and move to the countryside for a simpler life, even if that life was much harder. This period also marks the clear emergence of distinct new peoples in Canaan, most notably the Philistines along the southern coast, who we'll talk about more later, and the Israelites in the central highlands. While the origins of the Israelites are a subject of ongoing debate, with theories ranging from their being indigenous Canaanites who developed a distinct identity to groups migrating from outside the region, archaeological evidence clearly points to the development of unique cultural and religious practices in the hill country settlements during this time. The political landscape was highly decentralized. Gone were the powerful city-states paying tribute to distant pharaohs. Instead, we see smaller, localized political entities, often tribal confederations or small chieftaincies. There was no overarching authority across Canaan. This decentralization, while a consequence of collapse, also allowed for the independent development of distinct cultures and nascent political structures that would later become kingdoms. It was a chaotic but fertile ground for new identities to take root. Economically, the international trade networks that defined the Bronze Age were severely disrupted. Local economies focused more on self-sufficiency, with communities producing most of what they needed. While some limited local exchange undoubtedly continued, the grand scale of interconnectedness was a thing of the past. It was a step back from globalization, but a necessary reset. Historians still argue whether the widespread abandonment of coastal cities was due to destruction by the sea peoples, or if it was also linked to the disruption of maritime trade routes, rendering them less economically viable. Despite the relative darkness of this age compared to the Bronze Age, It was a crucial period of social and technological adaptation. The struggles forced innovation, resilience, and the forging of new group identities. The peoples of Canaan, whether indigenous survivors or new arrivals, were collectively building the foundations for the Iron Age kingdoms that would dominate the next millennium. It was messy, it was hard, but it was also the beginning of something entirely new. So, as Canaan was picking up the pieces in the early Iron Age, a particularly formidable and enigmatic group began to make their mark along the southern coastal plain. These were the Philistines, and their story is a gripping tale of migration, conflict, and the establishment of a distinct cultural identity that would become deeply intertwined with the narratives of the emerging Israelites. Imagine a group of battle-hardened seafarers, fresh off a devastating campaign, deciding to settle down and establish a new life, bringing their own unique customs to a disrupted land. As we touched upon earlier, the Philistines are widely identified with the Peleset, mentioned in Egyptian records, as one of the groups among the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt around the reign of Ramesses III, c. 1186–1255 BCE. After being repelled from Egypt proper, many of these groups, including the Peleset, seem to have settled in Canaan, particularly the fertile coastal strip. This wasn't just a haphazard scattering. They established a significant presence in a region that would become known as Philistia. One mainstream historical fact is the archaeological evidence of their settlement in 5 major cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, forming what's known as the Philistine Pentapolis. Their arrival clearly marked a dramatic cultural shift. Archaeologically, Philistine sites are characterized by a distinct pottery style, often with black and red geometric patterns on a white or cream slip, reminiscent of Aegean or Mycenaean ceramics. This is quite different from the local Canaanite pottery and provides strong evidence for their foreign origin. They also introduced new architectural styles, including unique hearths and megaron-type buildings, and new culinary practices, like the consumption of pork, which was not common among indigenous Canaanites or later Israelites. It's like a new restaurant opening up in town that serves entirely different cuisine. Militarily, the Philistines were formidable. They retained their military prowess from their seafaring days, and early on, they seem to have had an advantage in iron technology. While the rest of the region was slowly transitioning to iron, the Philistines appear to have been more advanced in its production and use, especially for weapons. This technological edge, even if temporary, would have given them a significant advantage over their neighbors, particularly the loosely organized Canaanite city-states and the nascent Israelite tribes. Imagine facing an army with superior metal weaponry when all you have is bronze and stone. Their political structure revolved around their 5 primary city-states, each likely with its own ruler, but often acting in concert as a confederation. They were a unified force when necessary, especially when confronting common enemies. This organized power base allowed them to dominate the southern coastal plain and exert influence into the adjacent hill country, inevitably leading to conflict with the emerging Israelite tribes. This ongoing struggle for land and resources forms a central theme in later biblical narratives, with famous figures like Samson and David battling Philistine champions. The relationship between the Philistines and the indigenous Canaanites was complex. While there's evidence of conflict and cultural distinction, there was also a degree of interaction and even cultural exchange. Over time, Philistine culture began to incorporate Canaanite elements and vice versa. It wasn't a static, isolated existence. They were an integral part of the evolving Iron Age landscape of Canaan. Historians still argue whether the Philistines were a purely destructive force, or if they also contributed to new trade networks and innovations in the region following the Bronze Age collapse. Their presence dramatically reshaped the political map of Canaan. They controlled vital coastal trade routes and agricultural lands, effectively blocking the Israelite tribes from access to the sea. The constant pressure from the Philistines was, in fact, a significant catalyst for the Israelite tribes to unite under a single monarchy. A story we'll explore next. The Philistines, though foreign in origin, became an indelible part of the Canaanite narrative, representing both a formidable adversary and a distinct cultural force in the early Iron Age. As the dust settled from the Bronze Age collapse and the Philistines established their strong foothold on the coast, the central highlands of Canaan were witnessing a different kind of emergence. The slow, sometimes messy, but ultimately transformative process of the united monarchy. This wasn't some sudden, pre-planned nation-building project. It was a response to external pressures, internal needs, and the rise of charismatic leaders. Imagine a collection of fiercely independent clans, constantly bickering, suddenly realizing they need to get their act together or face annihilation. That, in essence, is the story of the formation of ancient Israel. Before the monarchy, the Israelite tribes, if we can call them that, lived in a decentralized fashion, often described as a tribal confederacy or a segmentary society. They shared a common cultural and religious identity, centering around the worship of Yahweh, and sometimes united for defense under temporary leaders known as judges. But these were ad hoc arrangements, not a cohesive political state. They were like a loosely organized neighborhood watch, effective in small bursts, but not built for sustained challenges. The most significant external pressure that pushed these disparate tribes towards unity was undeniably the Philistine threat. As the Philistines expanded inland from their coastal cities, they clashed repeatedly with the Israelite settlements in the hill country. The Philistines' superior military organization and iron weaponry posed an existential threat. The biblical narrative of Saul, Israel's first king, clearly positions his rise as a direct response to this Philistine dominance. One mainstream historical fact is the archaeological evidence of Philistine cultural influence and military presence extending into the Israelite heartland during this period, confirming the nature of the conflict. So, out of this crucible of conflict emerged the concept of a single permanent leader, a king. Saul, often depicted as a tragic figure, was anointed as the first king of Israel, tasked primarily with leading the fight against the Philistines. While his reign was marked by initial successes, it ultimately ended in defeat and his death on Mount Gilboa. It was a shaky start for monarchy, proving that even with a king, unity was hard won. Then came David, a figure whose story is so central to later narratives that it's sometimes hard to separate history from legend. Originally a warrior in Saul's service, David eventually rose to power, consolidated his position, and crucially, successfully defeated the Philistines, pushing them back to their coastal enclaves. His strategic brilliance and charismatic leadership transformed the fledgling monarchy into a more stable and powerful entity. He captured Jerusalem, a neutral Canaanite city in the Central Highlands, and made it his capital, a brilliant move that avoided favoring any one Israelite tribe and provided a central administrative and religious hub. Imagine choosing a geographically central, non-aligned city as your nation's capital. Pure political genius. Under David, and then even more so under his son Solomon, the united monarchy reached its zenith. Solomon, famous for his wisdom and immense wealth, focused less on military expansion and more on building and administration. He oversaw the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, transforming the city into the undisputed religious heart of the kingdom. He also established extensive trade networks, engaged in diplomatic alliances, including with the Phoenicians, and initiated massive building projects across his kingdom. It was a period of unprecedented prosperity and international recognition for ancient Israel. However, historians still argue whether the scale and grandeur of Solomon's kingdom, as depicted in later biblical texts, is entirely supported by contemporary archaeological evidence. While there's clear evidence of large Iron Age settlements and increasing social complexity, the extent of a vast centralized empire under David and Solomon remains a subject of scholarly debate. It's one of those tantalizing questions that reminds us that history is often a puzzle with missing pieces. The united monarchy, though relatively short-lived compared to the great empires, was a pivotal moment for Canaan. It marked the rise of a powerful indigenous kingdom that would significantly impact the region's political and cultural landscape for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for many of the narratives and identities that define the subsequent history of the Levant. Alas, even the most glorious golden ages are fleeting, and the united monarchy of Israel and Judah was no exception. After the death of the famously wise, or perhaps famously opulent, King Solomon, the kingdom that David had painstakingly united fractured. Imagine a powerful company built by a visionary founder suddenly splitting into two rival factions right after the CEO retires. That's pretty much what happened around 930 BCE, leading to the divided kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This division would profoundly shape the political, religious, and cultural landscape of Canaan for the next few centuries. The primary reason for the split was a combination of internal tensions and leadership failures. Solomon's reign, while prosperous, had also been characterized by heavy taxation, forced labor for his massive building projects, and perceived favoritism towards his own tribe of Judah. When his son Rehoboam inherited the throne, he was advised to lighten the burdens on the northern tribes. Instead, he famously declared, "My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." This tone-deaf response was the final straw. The 10 northern tribes revolted and formed their own kingdom, retaining the name Israel, while the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the Kingdom of Judah. The Kingdom of Israel, with its capital eventually at Samaria, was geographically larger, more populous, and economically richer than Judah. It controlled the fertile northern plains and crucial trade routes. However, its political history was far more turbulent, marked by frequent dynastic changes, assassinations, and religious syncretism, often adopting aspects of local Canaanite worship alongside Yahwism. They had a revolving door of kings, some good, many, well, not so good. The kingdom of Judah, on the other hand, was smaller, more mountainous, and less prosperous. Yet, it enjoyed greater political stability, remaining under the Davidic dynasty for centuries, and its religious focus remained more consistently centered on the temple in Jerusalem and the worship of Yahweh. It was the underdog, but with a strong sense of identity and tradition. Despite the political schism, the two kingdoms shared a common cultural heritage, a shared language, though with dialectal differences, and many similar customs. However, the division led to centuries of often bitter rivalry, intermittent warfare, and shifting alliances against common enemies. They were like estranged cousins who sometimes needed to team up for family reunions or wars, but mostly just sniped at each other. Crucially, Canaanite influences continued to be strong, especially in the Kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom's closer proximity to surviving Canaanite populations and their established trade networks meant a more porous cultural boundary. Many Israelite kings in the north allowed, and sometimes even promoted, the worship of Canaanite deities like Baal and Asherah, leading to constant conflict with prophets advocating for strict adherence to Yahwism. This internal struggle, often depicted in biblical narratives, highlights the ongoing tension between a distinct Israelite identity and the pervasive cultural backdrop of ancient Canaan. Archaeological evidence from this period clearly shows two distinct political entities with different architectural styles and urban planning, while still sharing a broader Iron Age cultural milieu. One mainstream historical fact is the discovery of the Tel Dan Stele, a fragmented inscription from the 9th century BCE that mentions the House of David and the King of Israel, providing crucial extra-biblical confirmation of the existence of these two kingdoms and the Davidic dynasty. Historians still argue whether the religious syncretism in the northern kingdom was a pragmatic political choice to integrate disparate populations, or a genuine reflection of popular religious practices at the time. The divided kingdoms, while weaker individually than the united entity, allowed for the development of distinct identities and religious traditions that would later prove incredibly resilient. They would face new, terrifying threats from the emerging Assyrian Empire, which would ultimately bring an end to Israel and severely challenge Judah. But their distinct paths would ensure their individual legacies. While the Israelite kingdoms were busy squabbling in the highlands, the northern coastal strip of Canaan was quietly but powerfully forging its own destiny. We're talking about the Phoenicians, the true maritime masters of the ancient world. Imagine a small group of city-states, blessed with excellent harbors and abundant timber, turning their back on the land and embracing the sea, creating a commercial empire that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. This was the golden age of Phoenicia, roughly from 1200 to 300 BCE, a testament to their ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit. The Phoenicians were, in essence, the direct descendants of the late Bronze Age Canaanite populations who lived along the narrow strip between the Lebanon Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. When the Bronze Age collapse shattered the great empires and disrupted traditional land-based trade routes, these coastal cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad pivoted. Instead of relying on overland caravans, they looked to the sea, using their superior shipbuilding skills and seafaring knowledge to fill the commercial vacuum left by the collapse. It's like a shop that used to rely on foot traffic, suddenly realizing it can deliver anywhere in the world. Their success was built on several key factors. Firstly, their geographical location was ideal, with natural harbors and access to the vast timber resources of the Lebanon cedars, perfect for constructing sturdy ocean-going vessels. Secondly, they were master craftsmen, renowned for their production of purple dye, extracted from murex snails, a notoriously smelly but lucrative industry. Fine textiles, glass, and metalwork, this purple dye was so famous and so exclusive that it became a symbol of royalty and wealth throughout the ancient world. Imagine a color being so desirable that kings would pay exorbitant sums for it. But their greatest innovation, and their true legacy, was their unparalleled skill as traders and colonizers. They didn't just sail from port to port, they established a vast network of trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, reaching as far as Spain and even, potentially, around Africa. Places like Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, Gades, Cadiz in Spain, and numerous sites in Sicily, Sardinia, and Cyprus were founded as Phoenician colonies, serving as vital hubs for their commercial empire. This was globalization, ancient style, driven by sales and sheer determination. One mainstream historical fact is that the Phoenicians are credited with developing and spreading the alphabet, a revolutionary writing system that was much simpler than cuneiform or hieroglyphs. This phonetic alphabet, with its 22 consonantal letters, could be learned by merchants and common people, not just professional scribes. This innovation drastically simplified record keeping and communication, making trade more efficient and laying the groundwork for the Greek and Roman alphabets, and indeed, most alphabets used today. It's arguably one of the most impactful inventions in human history, born from the practical needs of commerce. Politically, the Phoenician cities were largely independent city-states, much like their Canaanite predecessors, often competing with each other, but also forming alliances when faced with common threats or pursuing shared commercial interests. They were ruled by kings, but these monarchs often shared power with wealthy merchant councils, reflecting the commercial nature of their society. Their influence on the wider Mediterranean was immense. They weren't conquerors in the typical sense. They were cultural disseminators. They brought Near Eastern goods, technologies, and ideas to the nascent civilizations of Greece, Italy, and beyond, playing a crucial role in the early development of Western culture. They were the intermediaries, the connectors, the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime, only slower, and with more danger. Historians still argue whether the Phoenician expansion was driven primarily by trade opportunities or by a search for raw materials, especially metals, necessary for their industries. Regardless, their impact was undeniable. As the Phoenicians were busy conquering the seas, another significant group, emerging from the vast deserts to the east, began to assert their presence across the land of Canaan and beyond. These were the Arameans, a Semitic-speaking people whose expansion from the 11th century BCE onwards profoundly reshaped the political and linguistic landscape of the Near East. Imagine a once nomadic people with their own unique language, slowly but surely establishing control over vital land routes and building powerful regional kingdoms, often right on the doorstep of the Israelite states. Unlike the Phoenicians, who primarily looked to the sea, the Arameans were masters of the overland trade routes. Their origins lie in the desert fringes of Syria and Mesopotamia, and from there they gradually migrated and settled in the fertile river valleys and strategic crossroads of the Levant. This expansion wasn't a single unified conquest, but a more gradual process of infiltration, settlement, and the establishment of numerous independent Aramean city-states and kingdoms. It was like a slow, steady tide, rather than a crashing wave. The most prominent of these Aramean kingdoms that directly impacted Canaan was Aram Damascus, centered around modern-day Damascus in Syria. This kingdom became a powerful regional player, often clashing with the northern kingdom of Israel. Other significant Aramean states included Beit Adini, Beit Gabari, and Hamath, forming a network of independent political entities that frequently engaged in shifting alliances, both with each other and with their non-Aramean neighbors. The Arameans were highly skilled in various aspects of ancient life. They were excellent merchants, facilitating trade across vast distances. They also introduced innovations in agriculture, particularly in water management. But their most enduring legacy, perhaps even more than their political achievements, was their language, Aramaic. This Semitic language, clear, concise, and relatively easy to learn, rapidly gained prominence as a lingua franca, a common language, across the Near East. It eventually supplanted Akkadian as the diplomatic and administrative language of empires, and later even overshadowed Hebrew as the spoken language among many Jewish communities. Imagine a language becoming so ubiquitous that everyone from common traders to powerful kings uses it for communication. That was Aramaic. One mainstream historical fact is that Aramaic eventually became the primary spoken language of the Persian Empire and remained influential for over 1,000 years. The relationship between the Arameans and the Israelite kingdoms was often tumultuous. The northern kingdom of Israel, being geographically closer to Aram Damascus, bore the brunt of Aramean expansion and military pressure. Biblical accounts are replete with stories of wars between the kings of Israel and the Arameans, with control over key cities like Ramoth-Gilead often shifting hands. These conflicts were not just about territory. They were also about control of crucial trade routes and access to resources. It was a constant tug-of-war, with brief periods of peace punctuated by cycles of hostility. Historians still argue whether the Aramean expansion was primarily driven by demographic pressures and a search for more fertile lands, or if it was a calculated strategic move to control the lucrative trade networks that crisscrossed the Levant. It was likely a combination of factors, a testament to their adaptability and ambition. Despite the conflicts, there was also cultural exchange and intermingling between the Arameans and the peoples of Canaan, including the Israelites. Aramaic influence can be seen in later Hebrew texts, and some Aramean artistic motifs found their way into local craftsmanship. The Arameans, though initially outsiders, became an integral part of the Canaanite tapestry, adding another vibrant thread to its complex historical narrative. Their enduring linguistic legacy, in particular, testifies to their profound and long-lasting impact, extending far beyond the borders of their individual kingdoms. Just as the various kingdoms of Canaan, including Israel and Judah, were getting comfortable in their regional squabbles, a truly terrifying force began to emerge from the east, one that would redefine warfare, empire building, and the very meaning of dread in the ancient world. This was the rise of Assyria, and their relentless, brutal expansion from the 9th century BCE onwards meant one thing for the kingdoms of Canaan: submission or utter annihilation. Imagine a technologically superior, utterly ruthless military machine setting its sights on your doorstep. That was the reality of Assyrian hegemony. The Assyrians, originally from northern Mesopotamia, had been a regional power for centuries, but starting with kings like Ashurnasirpal II and particularly Tiglath-Pileser III, they launched an unprecedented series of military campaigns that would create the largest empire the world had yet seen. Their success was built on several terrifying innovations: a highly organized and disciplined standing army, advanced siege warfare techniques like siege ramps and battering rams, and a systematic policy of deportation to break the spirit of conquered peoples and prevent rebellions. They weren't just conquerors. They were social engineers, albeit very cruel ones. One mainstream historical fact is the Assyrians were the first to employ iron on a massive scale for their army, equipping their soldiers with superior weapons and armor. For the kingdoms of Canaan, the Assyrian advance was a slow-motion nightmare. First, they demanded tribute. The weaker kings paid up, hoping to appease the giant. But paying tribute often wasn't enough. The Assyrians consistently sought more direct control. When a king rebelled or failed to pay, the Assyrian army would descend with terrifying efficiency, besieging cities, destroying crops, and carrying off entire populations into exile. The brutal reliefs from Assyrian palaces, depicting piles of heads and long lines of deportees, were not just artistic expressions. They were propaganda, designed to instill fear and deter resistance. It's like a really, really effective and terrifying marketing campaign. The Kingdom of Israel, the Northern Kingdom, was the first major Israelite entity to fall victim to Assyrian might. After decades of paying tribute, rebelling, and seeking feudal alliances with Egypt, Israel was ultimately conquered. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian king Sargon II, or possibly Shalmaneser Sophied before him, captured Samaria, the capital of Israel, and deported a significant portion of its population to various parts of the Assyrian Empire. These became the famous 10 lost tribes of Israel, largely assimilated into other cultures. This marked the definitive end of the Northern Kingdom, turning it into an Assyrian province. The Kingdom of Judah, though smaller and seemingly less appealing, couldn't escape the Assyrian shadow. King Hezekiah of Judah famously rebelled against Assyrian rule during the reign of Sennacherib in the late 8th century BCE. Sennacherib launched a massive campaign, conquering many Judean cities, but famously failed to capture Jerusalem itself. Biblical accounts and Assyrian annals, like the Sennacherib Prism, both describe this dramatic siege, with the Assyrian record boasting that Sennacherib imprisoned Hezekiah in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. While Jerusalem was spared, Judah was severely weakened and forced to pay a massive tribute. Historians still argue whether Sennacherib's failure to capture Jerusalem was due to divine intervention as suggested in biblical texts, an outbreak of disease in the Assyrian camp, or simply a strategic decision by Sennacherib to cut his losses after facing stiff resistance. It's a gripping cliffhanger from ancient history. Assyrian hegemony profoundly reshaped the political and demographic landscape of Canaan. Independent kingdoms were replaced by Assyrian provinces, administered by Assyrian governors. The policy of deportation led to a mixing of populations, further eroding older ethnic and cultural distinctions, while simultaneously introducing new ones. The region, once a mosaic of small states, became a cog in a vast, brutal imperial machine. The lesson was clear. Resistance was futile, and the price of defiance was annihilation. Just when it seemed like Assyria's iron grip on the Near East was absolute, the wheel of empire turned once more. The Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying might and brutal efficiency, began to crumble from internal strife and external pressures. From its ashes rose a new power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which would bring a different but equally devastating kind of dominion to Canaan, culminating in one of the most traumatic events in ancient Jewish history, the Babylonian captivity. Imagine a seemingly invincible superpower suddenly collapsing, only to be replaced by a new, equally formidable, but perhaps more focused conqueror. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under its brilliant and ambitious kings like Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, emerged as the dominant force in Mesopotamia. After defeating the Assyrians and their allies in the late 7th century BCE, having absorbed the remnants of the Assyrian Empire, Babylon now set its sights on the Assyrian provinces in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Judah, which had lingered on as a small, relatively independent entity, often playing a dangerous game of trying to balance between the declining Assyrians and the rising Egyptians. The Kingdom of Judah, having survived the Assyrian onslaught on Jerusalem, found itself in an increasingly precarious position. Its kings, caught between the overwhelming power of Babylon to the east and the fading but still meddling influence of Egypt to the southwest, made a series of miscalculations. Despite warnings from prophets, whose words are now part of sacred texts, some Judean kings pursued pro-Egyptian policies, leading to direct confrontation with Babylon. It was a fatal geopolitical gamble. Nebuchadnezzar II, the most powerful of the Neo-Babylonian kings, embarked on several campaigns into the Levant to assert Babylonian control. The first major blow to Judah came in 597 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, captured King Jehoiakim, and exiled a significant portion of the Judean elite, including the king, royal family, priests, scribes, and skilled craftsmen, to Babylon. This wasn't a total destruction yet, more like a warning shot across the bow, a strategic removal of leadership and talent. Imagine the shock and despair of being forcibly removed from your homeland, marched across vast distances, and settled in a foreign land. However, the Babylonians installed a puppet king, Zedekiah, who eventually rebelled, encouraged by anti-Babylonian factions and perhaps false hopes of Egyptian assistance. This defiance sealed Judah's fate. In 587-586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar launched his final devastating campaign against Judah. After a prolonged siege, Jerusalem fell. The city was systematically destroyed, its walls torn down, and the magnificent First Temple built by Solomon was utterly razed. This was a catastrophic event, far more thorough than the Assyrian capture of Samaria. The remaining population, except for the poorest and those necessary for basic agriculture, was deported en masse to Babylon. This became the defining event known as the Babylonian captivity or exile. One mainstream historical fact is that the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 586 BCE marked the end of an independent Judean kingdom and the beginning of a profound period of transformation for the Israelite identity, shifting it from a land-based kingdom to a community centered on religious identity and memory. Historians still argue whether the Babylonian policy of deportation was primarily an economic strategy to utilize skilled labor, or a political one to prevent rebellion by separating conquered peoples from their homeland. The impact of the Babylonian captivity on the exiles and on the remaining population in Judah was immense. It was a period of deep national trauma, religious questioning, and cultural adaptation. Yet, paradoxically, it also became a crucible for the forging of a stronger, more resilient Jewish identity. Away from the temple, new forms of worship and communal organization emerged, laying the groundwork for synagogues and a greater emphasis on written scripture. For Canaan, this meant another shift in imperial masters, a dramatic depopulation of its southern heartland, and a further erosion of indigenous political structures. The land was once again, and quite literally, left to rebuild, just when the Judean exiles in Babylon might have felt their world was forever lost. A new, surprisingly different empire emerged from the east, one that brought not just conquest, but also an unprecedented policy of relative tolerance and a willingness to allow conquered peoples to return home. This was the Persian Empire, under its visionary founder, Cyrus the Great, and its rise marked a significant turning point for Canaan and the exiled Judeans. Imagine a brutal occupier being overthrown, not by another brutal occupier, but by someone who actually listens to the complaints department. That was the Persian approach. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which arose from the ancient land of Persia, modern-day Iran, rapidly conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE. Cyrus the Great, a masterful strategist and statesman, swiftly established a vast empire that stretched from India to Greece. But what truly set the Persians apart from their Assyrian and Babylonian predecessors was their unique approach to imperial rule. Instead of systematic terror and mass deportations, the Persians generally adopted a policy of religious and cultural tolerance, recognizing the various traditions of their subject peoples, and crucially, allowing them to return to their homelands. This policy was famously articulated in the Cyrus cylinder, an ancient clay barrel inscribed with a declaration in Akkadian cuneiform, which describes Cyrus's benevolent rule and his policy of allowing deported peoples to return to their lands and rebuild their temples. One mainstream historical fact is that this cylinder is often cited as one of the earliest known declarations of human rights, albeit within an imperial context. It was a pragmatic policy too. Stable, contented provinces were less likely to rebel, and allowing local religious practices fostered loyalty. For the exiled Judeans in Babylon, Cyrus's decree was nothing short of miraculous. In 538 BCE, Cyrus issued an edict permitting the Jews to return to Judah and rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem. This marked the beginning of the return to Zion, a foundational event in Jewish history. While not all exiles returned immediately, many did, embarking on a challenging journey back to their devastated homeland. This return and the subsequent rebuilding efforts are chronicled in biblical books like Ezra and Nehemiah, depicting a community grappling with the immense task of restoration. Under Persian rule, Canaan, now largely incorporated into the Persian satrapy of Beyond the River, or Abarnahara, enjoyed a period of relative peace and stability. The region continued to be a vital land bridge and trade route within the vast Persian Empire. The various peoples of Canaan, including the returning Judeans, the Samaritans, who had developed their own distinct identity in the former Israelite territory, and the Phoenicians along the coast, coexisted under Persian administration. The Phoenicians, in particular, thrived under Persian rule, as their maritime expertise was invaluable to the empire's vast network. The Persians typically governed through satraps, governors, and allowed local authorities a degree of autonomy as long as taxes were paid and loyalty was maintained. This softer touch, compared to the previous empires, allowed for a period of cultural and economic revival in many parts of Canaan. The rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, completed in 516 BCE, was a monumental achievement, symbolizing the community's renewal and resilience. Historians still argue whether the Persian policy of tolerance was purely pragmatic, aimed at maintaining a stable empire, or if it also stemmed from genuine religious and philosophical principles unique to Persian thought. Regardless of the motivation, its effect on Canaan, particularly on the Judeans, was transformative. It allowed for the re-establishment of a distinct Judean identity and a renewed focus on religious law and communal life. The Persian period, while a time of foreign domination, was also a vital chapter in the continuity and development of the people and cultures of Canaan. Just as the Persian Empire seemed unassailable, stretching its benevolent, comparatively speaking of course, rule across vast swathes of the ancient world, a new, unforeseen storm brewed from the west. This was the lightning-fast conquest by Alexander the Great and the subsequent dawn of the Hellenistic period, an era that would infuse Canaan with Greek language, culture, and urbanism, fundamentally reshaping its identity. Imagine the entire world, suddenly being dominated by a completely alien culture, with new gods, new philosophies, and new ways of organizing society. That's what happened when the Greeks arrived. Alexander, a military genius from Macedon, part of Greece, launched his epic conquest of the Persian Empire in 334 BCE. His campaign was swift and decisive. In 332 BCE, he marched through Canaan, encountering some resistance, most famously at the Phoenician city of Tyre, which he besieged for 7 months. After conquering Egypt, he continued his eastward march, eventually creating an empire that stretched to India. For Canaan, Alexander's passage meant a swift change of overlords, from the Achaemenids to the Macedonians. However, Alexander's empire, vast as it was, fragmented rapidly after his premature death in 323 BCE. His generals, known as the Diadochi, carved up his immense territories, leading to decades of internecine warfare. For Canaan, this meant becoming a geopolitical football, caught between two of the most powerful Hellenistic kingdoms. The Ptolemaic kingdom, based in Egypt, ruled by Alexander's general Ptolemy and his descendants, and the Seleucid Empire, based in Syria and Mesopotamia, ruled by Seleucus and his descendants. These two dynasties fought over Canaan for over a century, with the region changing hands multiple times. Imagine being a small territory caught in a perpetual border dispute between two giant, constantly warring nations. It was exhausting. Despite the political instability, the Hellenistic period, roughly 332 to 63 BC, profoundly impacted Canaan's culture and society. The conquerors brought with them Greek language, Koine Greek, Greek forms of government, the polis or city-state, Greek philosophy, art, architecture, and athletics. New cities were founded or old ones were re-established with Greek names and urban planning, complete with gymnasia, theaters, and agorae. For example, ancient Beth Shean was refounded as Scythopolis, and Ptolemais, Akko, became a major port. This wasn't just superficial. It was a deep cultural infusion. One mainstream historical fact is the widespread adoption of Koine Greek as the lingua franca of trade and administration across the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. For the various peoples of Canaan, this Hellenization was met with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance. The Phoenician cities, already accustomed to maritime trade and cultural exchange, often embraced Hellenistic culture, integrating Greek gods into their pantheons and adopting Greek customs. Their coastal cities became vibrant centers of Hellenistic life. For the Judeans, particularly those in Jerusalem and the surrounding highlands, Hellenization was a much more contentious issue. While some Judean elites readily adopted Greek customs and language, others viewed it as a threat to their religious and cultural identity. This tension famously erupted in the Maccabean Revolt in the mid-2nd century BCE, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV of Epiphanes attempted to aggressively Hellenize Jerusalem, even desecrating the Second Temple. A Jewish rebellion, led by Judah Maccabee and his family, broke out. This successful revolt led to a period of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, the first independent Jewish state in centuries, demonstrating the resilience of indigenous culture against overwhelming foreign influence. Historians still argue whether the Maccabean revolt was primarily a religious struggle against Hellenization or a political struggle for self-determination against foreign rule. Ultimately, the Hellenistic period left an indelible mark on Canaan. While the land remained diverse, Greek culture became a pervasive force, influencing everything from urban design to intellectual thought. Even the Jewish state, once independent, would eventually find itself navigating a world deeply shaped by Hellenism, setting the stage for the next great imperial power to cast its shadow. Just as the various peoples of Canaan were finding their footing, be it under the subtle influence of Hellenism or the surprising independence of the Hasmoneans, another colossal empire began its slow, inexorable march eastward. This was Rome, a power that, unlike its predecessors, was less about cultural integration and more about efficient administration, military might, and the absolute imposition of its will. The Roman annexation of Canaan, starting in 63 BCE, brought an end to indigenous independence and ushered in centuries of direct, often heavy-handed, imperial rule. Imagine the grand and ancient civilizations of the Near East suddenly becoming mere provinces in a sprawling, meticulously organized, and utterly ruthless global empire. Rome's initial entry into Canaan came not through direct conquest of a unified state, but by exploiting the internal conflicts of the Hasmonean Jewish state. As the Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, vied for power, both appealed to the rising Roman general Pompey the Great for intervention. In 63 BCE, Pompey marched into Jerusalem, besieged the city, and effectively put an end to Jewish independence. He appointed Hyrcanus II as high priest, but stripped him of political power, making Judea a Roman client state. This was Rome's classic divide and conquer strategy, often starting with liberation and ending with annexation. Over the next century, Rome gradually increased its direct control. While initially working through client kings, most famously Herod the Great, who, despite his complex relationship with Rome and his Jewish subjects, was a magnificent builder, responsible for expanding the Second Temple to astonishing grandeur. The Romans eventually opted for direct provincial rule. After various revolts and administrative reorganizations, Judea became a full Roman province, governed by a Roman procurator. Roman rule brought both peace, the Pax Romana, and heavy oppression. On one hand, Rome built impressive infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and magnificent cities. They brought a highly organized legal and administrative system, and their military presence often suppressed banditry and intercommunal strife, at least for a time. Commerce flowed more freely within the vast Roman Empire, connecting Canaan to a wider imperial economy. It was a well-oiled machine, if you happen to be one of the gears, and not one of the individuals being crushed by the gears. However, Roman rule was also characterized by heavy taxation, cultural insensitivity, and an unyielding response to resistance. For the Judeans, in particular, the imposition of Roman rule, the presence of Roman pagan cults, and the perceived infringement on their religious autonomy led to deep resentment and multiple major revolts. The First Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 CE, which culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple and Jerusalem in 70 CE, was a catastrophic event that permanently reshaped Jewish life and history, further dispersing the Jewish population. Imagine a historical event so devastating it changes the entire trajectory of a people. Even after this, another major rebellion, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132-135 CE, was brutally suppressed, leading to even greater devastation. The renaming of Judea to Syria Palestina, a name derived from the Philistines, ironically, and the establishment of a Roman pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, on the ruins of Jerusalem. This period saw a massive depopulation of Judea and an even more widespread dispersion of the Jewish people, effectively ending any hopes of immediate indigenous political autonomy. Historians still argue whether the Roman policy of actively suppressing Jewish revolts through destruction and forced exile was a pre-planned strategy to eliminate dissent, or a reactive measure escalated by the severity of the Jewish resistance. For the other peoples of Canaan, like the Phoenicians and Samaritans, life continued under Roman rule, adapting to the new imperial realities. The region became a vital part of the Roman Empire, a strategic frontier province, a source of agricultural produce and a crossroads of trade. But its distinct local identities, while surviving, were now firmly subsumed under the vast overarching shadow of Rome, marking the effective end of ancient Canaan as an independent geopolitical entity. We've journeyed through millennia, from scattered hunter-gatherers to the mighty hand of Rome, watching Canaan transform and adapt with each passing empire. Now, as our story winds down, let's reflect on the profound and multifaceted, enduring legacy of this remarkable land and its peoples. For even though ancient Canaan, as a singular political entity, faded into history, its impact reverberated for centuries, shaping not only the region, but the entire course of human civilization. Imagine the countless threads woven over thousands of years, creating a tapestry so rich and complex that its patterns are still visible today. One of the most immediate and tangible legacies is in its geography itself. The strategic position of Canaan, a land bridge between continents, ensured it would always be a crossroads of peoples, ideas, and trade. This geographical destiny meant it was constantly influenced, yet also constantly influencing. It was a crucible where diverse cultures met, clashed, and blended, leaving behind layers upon layers of archaeological and historical evidence, like a palimpsest of human experience. But Canaan's legacy goes far deeper than just its location. Consider its cultural contributions, from the innovative Phoenician alphabet, a revolutionary writing system that became the ancestor of nearly all modern alphabets, to the sophisticated Canaanite mythologies and religious practices that often influenced and were influenced by their neighbors. The region was a vibrant hub of intellectual and artistic development. Think of how many words you're reading right now that are only possible because some ancient Phoenician merchant needed a simpler way to keep his accounts. That's a legacy that truly transcends time. Then there's the monumental religious legacy. It's impossible to discuss Canaan without acknowledging its pivotal role in the birth and development of the Abrahamic religions. The land itself is the backdrop for much of the Hebrew Bible, the setting for the foundational narratives of Judaism, and later, for significant events in Christianity. The very concept of a promised land is rooted in this ancient geography. Even as the Israelite identity evolved, it was intrinsically linked to the land and the narratives that unfolded there. This spiritual significance has shaped billions of lives for millennia, a truly astonishing impact. Historians still argue whether the early Israelite religion was a unique, radical departure from Canaanite polytheism, or if it evolved gradually, incorporating and adapting certain regional elements into its monotheistic framework. The very resilience of the peoples of Canaan, especially the Judeans, through centuries of conquest, exile, and foreign domination, is a testament to the strength of their cultural and religious identity. Despite the destruction of their temple and their forced dispersion, they maintained their heritage, creating a diaspora that would profoundly influence the world. This capacity for survival and adaptation amidst overwhelming odds is a powerful and inspiring part of Canaan's story. Even today, the echoes of ancient Canaan resonate. The names of its cities like Jerusalem, Gaza, and Tyre remain prominent on modern maps, often still sites of contest and profound historical memory. The archaeological sites continue to yield new discoveries, piecing together the intricate mosaic of life in this ancient land. Its languages, its myths, its trade routes, its struggles, and its triumphs. All of these form an inseparable part of the broader human story. And so, as the sun sets on our journey through ancient Canaan, remember that history isn't just a collection of dusty facts. It's the living, breathing narrative of humanity, full of conversation, strange facts, mysteries, and the enduring spirit of those who came before us. The ancient world, though far away in time, shaped the very ground beneath our feet and the ideas within our minds. As your thoughts drift, imagine the ancient winds whispering over olive groves, carrying the scent of cypress and the faint echo of distant marketplaces. The long parade of empires has passed, their banners folded, their trumpets silenced, but the land itself remains, holding countless stories in its soil. Let the echoes of those struggles and triumphs soften now, fading into the quiet of the night. Feel the weight of so many millennia settling gently around you, a peaceful, timeless presence. The vibrant tapestry of Canaan's history, with all its power and passion, has unwound. Allow yourself to float on the currents of time, suspended between the ancient past and the quiet present. Breathe softly. The stories have been told. The journey is complete. Rest now, deeply and peacefully.